Hi, my name is Dominik Hauser. I'm an iOS developer from Germany. And this is a video series about test-driven development in iOS. In this series, we will build together a small application using test-driven development. The application will fetch book data from this API. It's gutendex.com, and it provides free books. Everyone can read for free. And what we will build is an application that shows the books from this API in a list, and the user can click or tap on a book entry and see the details of the book. So the plan is to have an application that fetches the data from the internet or from the API and shows the list of the books and details of books. I've already created a project for that. This is just a plain iOS project with nothing. I have nothing added, just out of the template from Xcode. And as you can see, we even don't have any testing targets right now. We only have a main target. So we start by adding a testing target. We search for test, and we can choose between an UI testing bundle or a unit testing bundle. Test-driven development works best with unit tests because in unit tests you can replace implementations to mock objects to make your tests faster, and they also at least for me, don't break as often as UI tests. Okay, we created. We don't have to change anything in here and can finish. And now we have a testing bundle. And if we have a look what we got, this is what Xcode created. This is a test class. It inherited from XCTestCase. And we can now see what happens if we run our newly created tests. So, as you have seen, Xcode just removed the simulator. When I switch to the simulator, I now have a new one, a clone, but at the moment nothing is happening. So now it starts. Okay. But I would like to have my simulator all the time at this position where I had it just running before we started it. So I will remove this clone and I will change the scheme settings for our tests to not run in parallel. So I uncheck execute in parallel. This will result in just one simulator all the time when we run our tests, and we can now see how this looks if we run the tests again. Now we have our simulator we had before here again. I removed the clone. Now the application is built, deployed onto the simulator, and the tests are run. Here we go. Test succeeded. And if we now switch again to our test class, we see that the UI changed a bit. We now have those marks that show us that the tests have been successful. So the test passed. And we have two different kinds of tests. The first one is a normal test, as I would call it, and the second one is a performance test. And in the performance test, we have a measure block. This is this one here. And all the code we put into this measure code is run 10 times. And then Xcode generates a baseline when you run it the first time, and then compares all the other times when the performance test runs with the baseline. And if it differs from the baseline too much, then the test fails. Performance tests are not that important for test-driven development. So I will remove it. And let me just, because this is a new machine for me, I just activate the Vim mode because I can work in Vim mode best. Now let's see what the normal test looks like. So I will remove here this this comment, and as you can see, the test already passed. Let's see how it looks like when the test fails. Therefore, we use xet fail, and we can also provide a message just for demo. And now we can run the tests again, product test. And we see here how a test failure looks like. And this is very important. See what happens when I remove this line and run the tests again. The test passes, even though we are not doing anything in the test method. So this means you have to be very careful when you write tests, because when the test is doing nothing, executing no code at all or no production code at all, the test can still be passing, and this means it could be a false confidence for you that everything works, even though something is broken and you haven't realized it yet. As a result, you have to be very careful that you see your tests failing first before you make them pass again. And this is what is done in test-driven development. You start with a failing test, then you make the test green, and then you refactor your code and still keep the test passing. Okay, before we move on, I have to change here the settings because I don't like how it edits my code. I would like to have the indentation of 2. And now we can select all the code and re-indent. Okay, now let's move on. We would like to have a list of books. And in order to have a list of books, we need to fetch the list of books from the API I just showed you. So we need an API client. And in test-driven development, before we write any code, we start with the test for that code. So that's why we create a new test class, and it's a unit test case class, and I call it API client tests. Click next, create, and now we have this test class. And as you can see, I just re-indent it again. As you can see, it looks exactly like the test before. So this is the template we get all the time when we create a new test class. So again, we remove. Now this time we remove everything. We want to see. We want to figure out how this looks like if we just start from scratch. Okay, so let's say we first need a test function, a test method, and this is done like this. We create a function that begins with the word test. And this tells the test runner that this is a test it should execute. So, and now we expect that the API client has a method that is called books. And it should, sorry about that, return list of books. So we assume we have an API client, or we can create an API client. But now Xcode will complain because it doesn't know anything about API client. So we need to provide it with one. So I create a new file, and this will be a Swift file. And it's called API client. And in this, the API client, before we know anything about how it should manage its storage, or if it needs to be a reference type, we start with a value type. So we use here struct API client, and this is not enough to make this pass. First of all, we have to import the target, otherwise we don't see it. free books. And to make it available in our test target, we also need to make it public, and we need to provide it with a public init. This should be enough that the compiler is fine, I guess. Yeah. And now we need to do something with this API client. But when you look at what we have done here, we had to make API client public, and we also have to provide a public initializer to make it available in the test. This is not really what we want. We want to have normal internal class and normal internal initializer and also be able to test this. And this is what has Apple done with a special keyword. So I remove this again, and with this special keyword in front of the import, it's called testable import, we now get access to those internal methods, internal classes, internal types from our main target. And this means that we can now write this test without API client being public. Okay, now we want to execute something. We want to fetch the books. And this can be done with, or we assume that there will be a method called books. Of course, it will be asynchronous, so we have to await. And it could also throw an error if fetching doesn't work. So we also use try await. And the result will be a list of books. Okay, now Xcode is complaining. It doesn't know anything about this method. We have to add it to the API client. By the way, when something doesn't compile, this means this is a test failure. So if you can't compile anything, it's a failure in your tests, and you need to provide code that it compiles again. And this is what we are doing right now. We create a method or a function that's called books. And it will be asynchronous, and it might throw, and it will return a list of book objects. And now the compiler will again complain. It doesn't know anything about these books. So we created again a structure. Struct book, and before we know the data we want to store, we just use an empty struct. Now this should make the compiler not happy because we're not returning anything. So we return here an empty array of books. And now the test should compile. But now we get another thing, async to function blah blah to make it asynchronous. So we could either provide a task here, so wrap that call into a task. But test methods can be asynchronous. So we provide it with the async keyword. And there's also this error that can be thrown. So we could add a do catch block here. But tests in which an error is thrown, when we add the throws keyword to the test method, this means when there is an error thrown, then this test fails. So this is a very neat implementation Xcode provides us here. We just have to add the throw keyword, and when something throws within this test, then this test fails. This is what we want to have. And now let's have a look. We want to test that we assert. We want to be able to assert that we have fetched the books. And for this, I use I just have to figure out what comes from this API. So the first book is Romeo and Juliet, and we will figure out if books, the first object we get from this fetch, has a title that is equal to Romeo and Juliet. Now Xcode complains again because the book object doesn't have a title. So we add one, title, and it is of type string. And now the compiler should be happy again, and we should be able to run the test. I just used the shortcut Command U, and it already finished and tells us that the assertion failed. But we don't know exactly why. No, we know why. The title is not Romeo and Juliet, but the assertion isn't really helpful. It just tells us XCC assert true failed. And Xcode or XCTest comes with way more useful assert methods. And I show you just one of them. This is assert equals. And if we add the books first title and assert that it should be Romeo and Juliet. And when we run this test again with Command U, you see that it still fails, but the failure method is way more useful. It tells that it got nil, so the title of the book is nil, or maybe the first one is nil, and we expect it to be Romeo and Juliet. So this is already better, but not perfect. We want to know if the title is nil, or if the first element isn't there. So we can add another thing here. We can get the first book with try XCC unwrap. And what this does is it tries to unwrap this element, and if there isn't an element, this throws an error, or if it doesn't work to get this unwrapped element, it throws an error. But if there is an element, it just gives this element back and removes this optional. So it's not an optional anymore afterwards. We can use here the first book. It's not optional anymore. And if you run now the test again with Command U, we know exactly what's happened here. Our title is not nil. We knew the title can't be nil because it's not an optional property, but from the test itself we didn't knew that. But now we know exactly that unwrapping the type book from what we provided here didn't work. Okay, good. We have a failing test. We now have to try to make this test pass. And the easiest way to make this test pass is to just provide a book with that title from this books function. If we run this test now again, or our tests again, it still fails. Wait a minute. Okay, I just have a typo here. I expected the one. Juliet. So now it passes. But this is not what we want to have. We want to fetch the books from an API. But this is the easiest test to make this test pass. We need another test to make sure that we not only provide one book, but that we get the real books from the real API. And the first step in doing this is to check for another book in this example or in this result from this API. So I scroll down to the last book we get in this API call, and I check the same thing I've done here again for the last book. Here we checked for the first book, and now we get to the last book. So should return list of books. This is wrong. We don't check that there's a list. We check should return first book. And now we also should return last book. Oh no, I don't want to do that, sorry. So should return last book. We just change here that we get the last one. And this should be this one. So this is the last book we get from this API. Later we will see how to make a better test about this, how to test really that we are fetching from the API and not provide a local book, a local list of books. But for now, this is what we can do today. We can check if there is a list of books with the first book like this, Romeo and Juliet, and the last book, How to Pick a Mate, A Guide to Happy Marriage. So this is what I wanted to show you today. Before we wrap up, I just want to remove this unneeded test class. We now have a test class for API and client tests. And next time we will add some code that actually proves us in the test that we are fetching from an API. We won't do the fetch in the test because this takes too long and the test has to be very fast. So we won't fetch exactly from the API, but we will provide our program or our test with a mock that looks like the real API. And then we can figure out if our code actually does the fetch to the API or if it uses a local book list like we have provided here. So this will be done in the next video. We will provide it with a mock to show that we actually are fetching from the API. So thank you for watching. If you liked it, let a comment, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, something like that. Tell your friends, I don't know. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.